One of Dark Souls 3's most important and influential mechanics, at least in terms of game feel and play conditioning, is also one of its most obfuscated and misunderstood. I'd bet a good chunk of players didn't even know the system existed in the first place. I was one of them for multiple playthroughs, thinking it was something one-off or whatever, rather than a system that pervades the entire game, arguably affecting how the game itself is played. Every so often, when you're killing random enemies, one of your Estus flasks can be restored, signified by a sound and a special particle effect different from the normal white souls. The actual mechanics of the system took me a long time to figure out, and I even had some help with the data mining from Raven, a member of my Discord server, and from Gremlin on Tumblr with the math stuff, who Raven actually got me in contact with, so huge thanks to both of them. I wouldn't have been able to make this video without them. I can very much promise that this isn't like Dark Souls 1 Estus refill, where if a player kindles a bonfire near you, you get an extra flask, partially because Dark Souls 3 doesn't have kindling, but it doesn't even apply to activating a bonfire or whatever. It is specifically and exclusively tied to enemies. It's also not like the humanity drop system from Dark Souls 1, where you build up points for every enemy killed until hitting a threshold and getting a flask. It's not tied in any way to the item drop system, so increasing your luck, wearing the gold serpent ring, symbol of avarice, whatever, nothing will affect the chance of Estus recovery, and nothing about the Estus recovery system affects item discovery. Instead, at its most basic, it's pure chance, with each enemy having its own specific recovery rate for either kind of Estus. There's significantly more to it than that, from mechanics, uses, and specifics, but if you're just wondering purely what causes the refill and how exactly to get that refill, there it is. Now for those of you who are just as nerdy as me, we can get into the nitty-gritty. I think the biggest thing about this mechanic is how much it changes how the game is played. It's actually kind of the opposite of extra heals in the other games. From humanity, divine blessings, and Elizabeth mushrooms being mostly last resorts in Dark Souls 1 due to their speed and availability, to life gems in Dark Souls 2 since you would want to specifically use them outside of combat due to their slow healing. Dark Souls 1 and 2 expect you to do what you can to get through encounters without taking damage whatsoever, or at least with only taking very limited damage in the case of Dark Souls 2, using Estus only when you absolutely need to during encounters. Dark Souls 3, on the other hand, doesn't really expect you to do anything hitless at all, and the game is very much designed around that. Take what used to be one of my favorite examples of what I disliked about Dark Souls 3 as an example. In the high wall, on the way up to the elevator shortcut, there's a single hollow in the middle of a room. Looking around the corners doesn't yield any information about other enemies, aside from potentially seeing the ones hanging off the edge, which is unlikely given the foliage that is there entirely to obscure them. The game clearly expects you to take down the single hollow in the middle of the room, get ambushed by the others, then take them out, reacting as they come instead of preparing for the ambush beforehand. The single enemy puts you directly in the middle of the others. With that, you're almost guaranteed to get hit, but that doesn't really matter because you can use a quick heal and will still most likely get it refilled pretty quickly, if not from these hollows specifically, then some of the ones later on. Compare this to a similar encounter in Dark Souls 1, in the Undead Burg going up to the ladder to get out of the alley in the very first area. There are 4 hollows hanging off the edge, but instead of having an enemy in the middle to draw you in, since that would effectively be a death sentence in this game, they're clearly visible if you're paying attention, not obscured by foliage, and can easily be funneled one by one as long as you're not sprinting into the middle of danger. If you were to be caught between them, you could very easily be stun-locked to death, especially this early on in the game. Otherwise, you'd be using an Estus that you won't recover until the bonfire about halfway through the stage. I think the Knight class, the basic quintessential class between the two games, really reinforces that too. In Dark Souls 1, the Knight is slow and tanky, while in Dark Souls 3, the Knight can still fast roll and is highly maneuverable, using one of the fastest weapon classes in the game that still has decent reach and versatility. Dark Souls 2 breaks from that a bit in that the Knight class doesn't exactly define how the game is expected to be played. You don't start with a shield, despite shields being at their most viable here. You start with a basic middle-of-the-road weapon in terms of damage, range, and speed. I think that works for Dark Souls 2 though, considering that the game expects you to find a playstyle that works specifically for you. In the same way, the most similar encounter I can think of in the game is in the Forest of Fallen Giants when you're walking up the giant stone sword. This works both in Scholar and Vanilla, surprisingly. In Vanilla, there's a single soldier on the sword, guarding an item. If you're observant, you can see the enemy to the left of the sword laying down, and you can see the enemy that drops down behind you before it attacks. In Scholar, there's nothing on the sword but the item, but you can still see the enemies that drop down and attack you before they actually do. If you run straight to the item or the enemy in vanilla, you'll be attacked one by one due to the shape of the path and how the enemies are placed, but if you're observant, you can deal with the threats before they're threats, and both styles work just fine. It just depends on how you want to play. Understanding this, and what the Estus recovery mechanic is, really helped me enjoy Dark Souls 3 a lot more since I was actually playing how the game expected me to, instead of trying to play it like Dark Souls 1. That's not to say that the game can't be played like that. I know plenty of people prefer playing the game that way, but in my mind, it's pretty clear the game communicates that you should be aggressive and get rid of the most present threat as soon as possible, as opposed to the slow, methodical, careful approach in Dark Souls 1, but I digress. I want to get into the actual internal machinations of the Estus recovery to see how much this was thought out, or to see if it was just a mechanic kind of thrown in to balance the game's playstyle with the absurd amounts of enemies and areas. The first thing we figured out was exactly how likely it is to get a refill from each individual enemy, since that was mostly obvious in the game files. Not every enemy has the parameter to even have a chance to refill Estus. For instance, NPCs will never refill Estus unless they are specifically an enemy, like Horus being Hollow in the Lake. If you kill Horus at any other time, he simply won't have a chance to refill any of your Estus. There are 3 separate parameters for different kinds of recoveries, one for the chance to refill both flasks at once, one for the chance to refill only Estus, and one for the chance to refill only Ashen. Most normal enemies have about a 3% chance to give you a refill, with harder enemies being about 15%, and most magic using enemies can refill Ashen. This isn't a rule by any means, and I'll go over specific chances in a minute, but it is good to remember that, generally, magic users can refill Ashen and harder enemies are more likely to refill your Estus. A few magic users can only refill Estus, and all skeletons exclusively refill Ashen, and there's probably some weird lore mixed in there, like how skeletons are only animated because of death magic or whatever, but with how janky mechanics like this are, I wouldn't take anything regarding this mechanic as 100% proof of anything, just like how weird the humanity drops are in Dark Souls 1. It's also worth mentioning that if something has the chance to refill both kinds of Estus, it doesn't have the chance to give you one or the other. It will always refill both if you get the recovery chance. If you don't care about the specific recovery chances for each individual enemy, I have chapters set up so you can skip past all of this, but for those of you who are curious, Lion Knight Albert, Blackhand Kamui, daughter of Crystal Cramhild, the Madwoman, Cirrus of the Sunless Realms, Henri of Astora, Horus the Hushed, the Swordmaster, Yellowfinger Heisel, Holy Knight Hodrick, specifically during Cirrus's quest, the Londor Pale Shade, both Exile Watchdogs, the Unkindled Brigand and Thief, the Court Sorcerer, Havel the Rock, the Drakeblood Knight, Unkindled Ricard, both Dring Knights, Nightslayer Sorag and his Red Phantom variant, Creighton the Wanderer, Alva Seeker of the Spurned, Longfinger Kirk as a Red Phantom, the Crystal Sage in the Grand Archives, the Serpent Man Summoners, and the Demon Cleric all have a 15% chance to refill one of both of your flasks. Sir Wilhelm has a 15% chance to restore 2 of each of your flasks, and the Mad Phantom variant of Hodrick, when he invades you in the Undead Settlement before the Curse-Rotted Greywood, is the only enemy in the entire game that is guaranteed to give you any Estus at all, and you will always refill 3 Estus flasks and 2 Ashen Estus flasks. Any other guaranteed flask refills are not handled by this system at all. I'm honestly kind of struggling with how I should format the rest of these, since some of them have the chance to refill both, but the chances are handled separately. For instance, the Cathedral Knights in the Cathedral of the Deep have a 15% chance to refill each flask individually, but not both. They can refill both if both 15% chances get procced, but it's not guaranteed to fill both if it refills one. Also, as a weird anomaly, and just something to strengthen that you should take these with a grain of salt when it comes to lore, the Cathedral Knights in the Castle have a 15% chance to refill Estus, but only a 10% chance to refill Ashen. That either creates a headcanon or it doesn't matter at all. I think I'm going to go through the Estus and Ashen refill chances separately. That might be the easiest way to comprehend this deluge of information. The Amnesiac Lap Red Phantom, Shira, Desert Pyromancer Zoe, Puss of Man, Cathedral Knights, Cathedral Evangelists, Cathedral Grave Wardens, Winged Knights, Lycanthropes, Giant Serpentmen, Silver Knights, Sages Devout, Irithil Fire Witches, Corvian Knights, and the Ariandel Great Crabs all have a 15% chance to recover an Estus Flask. There are a few more that have 15% chance, but they're weird, and I'll cover them on their own in a moment. Black Knights, Boreal Outrider Knights, Dark Wraiths, and a few Millwood Knights, particularly the Earthseekers and Great Bow Wielders that specifically drop 2,400 and 3,500 souls, all have a 15% chance to recover 2 Estus Flasks. All other Millwood Knights have a 9% chance to recover a single Estus Flask. hollow soldiers, large hollow soldiers, Karthus swordsman skeletons, hollow slaves, small grus, infested corpses, peasant hollows, hollow manservants, archive scholars, Erythilian slaves, lycanthrope hunters, serpentmen, undead clerics, devout of the deep, sage prentices, lothric priests, bonewheels, pontiff knights, writhing infested corpses, wretches, mimics, corvians, dying corvians, jailers, deacons, Farron followers, and Corvian villagers all have a 3% chance to recover Estus. Oh my god, that section is going to be so awful to edit. Please pray for me. Ashen Estus is a lot less common to recover, but the chances are generally higher. As such, this section should go by a bit quicker. Skeletons, overgrown skeletons, the torch variant of Farron followers, and the tree women have a 3% chance to recover a single Ashen Estus. The Cathedral Knights in the Lothric Castle have a 10% chance to recover a single Ashen Estus, while the Cathedral Knights in the Cathedral of the Deep have a 15% chance to recover Ashen Estus. Archive Scholars also have a 15% chance to recover Ashen Estus, along with the Sorcerer Erythilian Slaves. At least we think. It's unclear in the files, but it makes sense. The special Millwood Knights mentioned earlier have a 15% chance to recover 2 Ashen Estus, but no other Millwood Knights. Cathedral Evangelists in the Cathedral of the Deep, Cathedral Grave Wardens, Sages Devout, and the Erythilian Fire Witches all have a 30% chance to recover 1 Ashen Estus. Finally, the Grus, both normal and smoldering, but only those wielding a dagger and talisman, and those who are mad and horned, and the Cathedral Evangelists in the Undead Settlement have a 40% chance to recover a single Ashen Estus. There are a couple anomalies that I want to go over, though. First of all, the Lothric Knights are really weird. Most have a 15% chance to refill a single Estus flask, but the red-eyed variant in the High Wall, the blue one with the straight sword, and the ones with the great sword in the Archives actually have a 15% chance to recover 2 Estus flasks. That doesn't include the overgrown Lothric Knights, who mostly have a 15% chance to recover a single normal Estus flask, but the greatsword variant has a 15% chance to recover 2 normal Estus, and a 20% chance to recover 2 Ashen Estus. The red-eyed variant in Lothric Castle has a 20% chance to recover an Ashen Estus as well, but the red-eyed variant that drops 5,000 souls has a 15% chance to recover 2 normal Estus, and a 20% chance to recover 2 Ashen Estus. I think that mostly covers the Lothric Knights, that they're really weird. The DLC is strange when it comes to recovery chances, since it seems like Ariandel has a very little focus on the mechanic, while nearly every enemy that engages with it from the Ring City has a unique chance. For instance, the wolves in Ariandel actually have a parameter to be able to recover Estus, but they have a 0% chance to recover any Estus at all. If I had to guess, it's likely because the wolves are also in the Champion's Gravetender fight, and the developers didn't want you to be able to refill your Estus at all during the fight. The Millwood Knights are the only thing in the entire game to have a 9% chance at all, and the Great Crabs here have a chance to recover Estus, but the ones in the base game don't at all, so it just feels kind of strange. The Ringed City, on the other hand, feels a lot more fleshed out. The Pilgrim Angels are the only thing in the entire game to have a 24% chance to recover anything, and they have that chance for both normal and Ashen. Ring Knights are the most normal when it comes to the Ring City exclusive enemies. The Straight Sword variants have a 15% chance to recover 2 normal Estus, and a 15% chance to recover 2 Ashen. The rest have a 15% chance to recover 1 normal Estus, and a 3% chance to recover 1 Ashen. The Judicators have separate 12% chances to recover 2 of each kind of Estus. The Clerics are also pretty normal, with a 3% chance to recover a single Ashen Estus. The Harald Knights, however you pronounce that, it's spelled weird, have a 12% chance to recover 1 normal Estus, and the Big Locusts have a 6% chance to recover 1 normal Estus. That should cover every enemy that engages with this system. If I didn't mention it, it doesn't use this system at all. I'll leave a link to the spreadsheet covering every enemy's recovery chance in the description as well if you're curious about anything specific. There is still a bit more to cover with the recovery chances though, as it seems like there's a sort of pity system that makes it more likely to get a recovery under specific circumstances. Figuring out how this system worked was by far the most difficult and time-consuming part of the process, and I'm still not entirely sure how it works or if it even exists, but I'm relatively certain I understand the basics. Early on in my quest to understand the pity system, I actually messaged Illusory Wall himself to see if he had anything to say on this topic.
Hey, I haven't actually seen anything concrete on this myself, so I'd be curious to see how the drop rates have been figured out. It'd be new info to me. I don't believe it was handled in item lots like regular item drops. The only thing I ever really got to test regarding it to prove it wasn't accumulating like soft humanity in Dark Souls 1, and that it's true, pure RNG, is that I kept starting new characters over and over until literally the first hollow in the starting cemetery was able to refill my charge. That I consider to be really solid proof that it's not anything like getting soft humanity in Dark Souls 1. It's not building up like a point system.
So it looks like I'm kind of flying blind, since I had figured out more than he had at this point, and he's the guy for obscure Dark Souls mechanics. All I really had to go off of was the name of the internal parameter, which is Mist Flask Recovery Bonus Chance, and then parenthetical, Estus Flask Recovery Failed Lot Point Add. The name initially led us to believe that it would increase the more times in a row you didn't get a recovery, but every time I did any testing, the chances would line up nearly perfectly with the normal drop chance. If it was increasing the more I failed to get a recovery, then I would get the recovery more often than expected. The process for testing the theories we had was really tedious and was easily the worst part of making this whole video, aside from editing it, probably. Anyway, I would kill the first 20 enemies in the undead settlement, record which ones dropped Estus, if any, and seeing how that compared to the predicted drop rate. My initial 20 runs were all with my Estus consumed, and I got a lot more Estus than we predicted. It seemed like the drop chance was closer to 5% than 3%. When I did the same thing, 20 runs with no Estus consumed, I ended up getting nearly exactly 3%. The only problem was when I did the same thing on a different character with 7 total Estus, 4 allotted to health, I got almost exactly 3% again. This led me to believe the proportion of Estus didn't matter, only the total amount of Estus used. At this point, I did end up taking a really long break, 4 months to be exact. I was really tired of running through the undead settlement and just couldn't be bothered to do it again under different circumstances. And when I did finally come back to this, I actually ended up doing the testing on the 3 knights just outside the dancer's room. That way, it's all the same enemy, all right next to a bonfire, and all with a decently high chance to drop. In the settlement, the peasants and hollow slaves have a 3% chance to drop, but I didn't want my testing to be muddled with different enemies, even if they're the same on paper. I did 4 runs of killing 100 knights, all with different amounts of Estus. For the first one, I drank one of my 15 flasks, only drinking one so I could actually tell if I got a recovery. The particle effect isn't very obvious. With that, I got 12 out of 100 recoveries, which is only slightly lower than the base chance of 15%. For the next run, I used all 15 Estus and got 19 out of 100 recoveries. For the next, I made a new character and did the same thing with only 3 Estus, using 1 and doing the run. I only got 11 out of 100, but that's really close to the 12 of 100 earlier. Finally, I did another 100 with all 3 of my Estus drained and got 17 out of 100 drops. I can't say anything definitive with only 4 tests like that, but with those combined with the test that I did 4 months ago, on top of the playthrough I did kinda recently, I'm reasonably certain there's a pity system. Instead of increasing your chance as you fail more recoveries, it instead increases as you lose more Estus. I would imagine, instead of being literally failing recoveries, it's named like that because it's re-rolling your chance to get a recovery if you fail the first one. It might be a chance to get a reroll or something. I don't know exactly. It's hard to say the exact chances with the little testing I've done. But honestly, it takes so much time to do each test, and I just don't have the manpower to give more than vague answers in this specific part of the topic. If somebody can use something like Cheat Engine or whatever to figure out the actual use of it, or even what increases the parameter in the first place, I'd be extremely grateful. For now though, this is the extent of the knowledge that exists about this mechanic, at least as far as I know. So this video took a long time to make. Obviously it took longer than it should have, because I took a 4-month break in the middle of it, but that's neither here nor there. I have a webcam, or I'm using my webcam, so sorry if it looks terrible, but I wanted to have my face up here, first of all, because I thought it would be fun to kind of like make an homage to Dark Souls Dissected, because obviously this is heavily based on Dark Souls Dissected. Speaking of, thank you to Illusory Wall for voicing that little segment that he did. So I actually just finished editing the video, but I wanted to come in here and say a little bit of afterward, and I know this looks way better. My phone camera is way better than my webcam, but it's way harder to record with. That's why I'm holding it. I don't actually have a tripod. I was right, it was awful to edit. It took like between 5 and 10 hours. It wasn't as bad as I was expecting. Anyway, I mostly wanted to interject here to say that Illusory Wall is one of my favorite content creators, and the fact that I did something involving him at all is so surreal to me. And Dark Souls Dissected is actually like one of the biggest inspirations for my challenge runs, how I do my challenge runs, and why I make my content. So once again, huge thank you to Illusory Wall. But also I figured it would probably make it a little bit easier to edit. Anyway, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I love you all. And I especially want to thank Rotini, Eth, Swaffy Plays, Andy, Frippy, Luddy, Nedjow Benabena, Spape, Penguin Z, Cassie Gretch, Nihilistic Pangolin, Hillary H, Lucas Arcoverde, Howling Nocturne, Magnetar Technologies, Harrison Briggs, Barnabas P., Trev the Dev, Edvin, Mabel Pancakes, Christian Dunbar, Holly Warlock, Lilith, Lamastusel, Racuna, I Like Goats, Deuterium Oxide, Zekrom, Robin Torsten Grabsky, Krista, White Flame, V, Manarok, and Ryan Rickard. Thank you all for supporting the channel. I don't know how to end this.